to get the perspective of a government MP, I'm joined now from Melbourne by Victorian Liberal Senator James Paterson. James, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Jane.
Just sticking with this issue of these rising tensions between the US and China and what on earth that means for Australia, was Andrew Hastie freelancing here as a backbencher, or was he expressing sort of widely held views from our defence and intelligence establishment?
Well, I guess the most direct way to put it, Jane, is that Andrew was using his freedom on the backbench to give voice to the concerns that many of us share and hold. And I back Andrew Hastie 100% on this issue, as I know many others do as well.
Scott Morrison has said that the government's been consistent, that Australia's response to China remains unchanged. But can it remain unchanged given we've seen China's military build-up in the South China Sea? We've seen accusations of China stealing intellectual property. We've seen its rising influence over Chinese diaspora. Are these not reasons to sort of shift our thinking?
Well, I think the government's been very clear for a number of years about a number of our concerns about the behaviour of the Chinese government in the South China Sea, as you say. But you only have to look in the newspapers this morning to learn about an international student studying at an Australian university whose parents were visited back in China, who had clearly threatened because he'd attended a rally. You had the Chinese Consul General in Brisbane encouraging Chinese nationalist students to go to these pro-democracy protests and clearly intimidate students who are voicing support for Hong Kong. So there are reasons for concern, and that's what Andrew Hastie was giving voice to in his article today.
China is, of course, our most important trading partner. They could use, or the country could use, its economic might to really hurt Australia. I mean, are we at risk here of, making our already frosty relations with Beijing even worse and then suffering economically?
China's absolutely a valued trading partner, and I think the hundreds of millions of people that have been lifted out of poverty in China over the last 30 years is one of the greatest human achievements of this century, and something that the Chinese are rightly very proud of. But if ever we are forced to choose between our values and a dollar, I think we choose our values every day of the week. We cannot compromise our values for trade, and that's an enduring value of Australia.
So Scott Morrison also says that we don't need to make a choice between the US and China, but you're saying pretty clearly there that if it came down to it, you'd choose the US.
Well, I hope we never have to make an explicit choice like that, but I think that what is enduring is our commitment to principles, principles of freedom of speech and democracy, free assembly, freedom to protest, the right to live one's life according to their own values without the government telling us what we can and can't do. And I think our values should always be put first.
Would you like to see Australia take a more assertive stance, start standing up for its values, perhaps by conducting more naval patrols in the South China Sea, by expanding our presence in the Pacific, our military presence?
I'm certainly not going to freelance on naval operations on your program, I'm sorry, Jane, but I think the Foreign Minister, for example, has been very clear in recent weeks about Australia's concern about the activities that are happening in Hong Kong, about our sympathy with the protesters and their concerns. It was Australia a few years ago that decided we didn't want to have an extradition treaty with China, so we absolutely understand why the people of Hong Kong have grave fears about what that would mean for their safety and security and freedom if they did too.
All right, well, let's turn to another big issue this week, and that was the High Court's ruling that a public servant breached their code of conduct, the Public Service Code of Conduct, when she anonymously tweeted comments criticising immigration and border force policies. She was ultimately sacked from her position. But you back the High Court's ruling. Why?
I'm someone, Jane, who believes that we should have the least number of restrictions on freedom of speech possible. But one restriction which I think is reasonable is if you enter into employment contract that you are bound by certain conditions, including not criticising your employer. Ms Banerjee was not just merely critical of the then Labor government's policies on border protection, but she was critical of her department, her colleagues in the department, and the way the department was being run. There isn't an employer in the country that would tolerate their employees tweeting about that. You couldn't tweet about the ABC in that way and still come into work on Monday.
But putting that aside, these tweets were made under an anonymous account. They were made mainly in out of hours or out of work time. So isn't this a case of the employer encroaching on their employees' private life?
I would have a lot more sympathy if Ms Banerjee was tweeting about things that were not related to her employment that were still political in nature. So if she wanted to share her views anonymously or otherwise on social media about climate change policy in a way that was critical of government policies, then I think sacking her probably would go too far. But in this instance, she was tweeting about her own area of expertise, about her area in which she was charged with fulfilling responsibilities on behalf of the Australian people, and I think that is a very different set of circumstances.
Ms Banerjee's lawyer said after the ruling yesterday that it means anything a public servant does has to be with loyalty to the government, not critical of it. What do you make of those comments? Is this a new precedent for the public service?
I'm not sure that's right. Public servants are Australian citizens in every respect of every other Australian citizen. They have the same rights to participate in the political process. They can join political parties, they can join third-party activist groups, they can, on their weekends and in their own spare time, campaign freely. They can even run for office if they choose. So I don't accept that this is a blanket restriction, but it is a reminder that if you are a public servant, that it's probably not a good idea to tweet about your direct work responsibilities, even if you think you're doing so with the cloak of anonymity, because as Ms Banerjee discovered, that's not always a permanent cloak.
I mean, we know the public service itself has to be apolitical, but public servants aren't necessarily, free of political inclinations. We know that many public servants are members of political parties. What if Ms Banerjee decided to go to a branch meeting for either the ALP or the Liberal Party and start espousing her views on immigration and border protection? Would that be the same or different?
I think it'd be very similar. I don't think it's just because it was on social media that it was a problem. It was that she was divulging things related to her employment and talking about her employment in a public way. And I guess a public meeting would be very similar to that. But if she wanted to go and talk about, as I said, as an example before, climate change or any other matter in those meetings, I don't think it would be the same problem.
All right, so it's specifically that she was criticising the specific portfolio that the area that she was working in.
It was directly relevant to her employment, yes.
All right, well, we had overnight an interesting intervention from the former High Court Judge Kenneth Hayne. It was a speech he actually gave a while ago, but was only just published. Now, he argued that trust in institutions has been destroyed and policy debates have been replaced by 3 or 4 word slogans. Now, you're in Parliament, you're part of the Morrison government. How do we get here?
I hope I haven't used any 3-word slogans in this interview so far, Jane, or even a 4-word slogan.
They'd be very expansive answers.
In fact, a 3-word slogan is a slogan in and of itself when whether it's used by a judge or anyone else. I think it's true that trust in all of our institutions has fallen, and by the way, I'd include the judiciary in that. They are not exempt from that. When you see some of the decisions handed down in my home state of Victoria around sentencing, if you took a public poll on that, I think you'd find some very, very strong criticism from Victorians about Mr Hayne's profession as you would about my profession. So I think it is a widespread phenomenon. Trust in institutions has been undermined in recent years, there's no question.
But what has undermined the trust? What has led to this degradation in trust?
Look, I think there's a range of things. I think the changing media environment we're in produces more scrutiny, and social media is part of that. It's much easier to become proximate to the people that govern you than in a way that you weren't before, and you can see them warts and all their flaws and otherwise. And I think some of our institutions have failed. I mean, when you can only think about the Catholic Church when it comes to child abuse or government in other areas, our banks when it comes to the financial crisis. A lot of institutions have failed, and it's right that the public is sceptical about some of those institutions, and it's up to us to renew their faith in it through our performance.
Kenneth Hayne, of course, led the Banking Royal Commission, but that's just one of many judicial probes we've had or are having at the moment. We've had an Aged Care Royal Commission, Disability Royal Commission to come. Before the Banking Royal Commission, we, of course, had the institutional responses to child sex abuse. What do you make of the argument that governments are outsourcing tough decisions, tough policy decisions to the judiciary through the Royal Commission process?
I think each of those Royal Commissions on their own have great merit, but I am concerned about the trend where there isn't public expectation or certainly a stakeholder expectation that a Royal Commission be called to solve every problem. And it seems that many people think that we don't take their problems seriously unless a Royal Commission is being called. I probably get a dozen emails a day calling for different Royal Commissions into different areas. And I think there are real limitations with that model. There is only so much that can be gleaned from a Royal Commission model, and it's up to us as politicians to demonstrate the other avenues we have for solving complex problems in our society that aren't necessarily going to be best solved by that means.
And just finally, James Paterson, how do you solve the complex problem of restoring the public's faith in our institutions and specifically the Parliament where you work?
I think it's something that will only happen over time, and we can only do that by demonstrating our performance and our adherence to the expectations that the public has of us. I think we need to demonstrate that the policies we're enacting are the policies that they sent us there to enact. I think that's critically important, that it's having a material benefit and impact on their lives in a tangible way, that we're focused on the things that they're concerned about, that are of their top of mind, and not the things that we might be concerned about. They're just some things that we need to do.
All right, James Paterson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jane.